You're asleep next to your wife. Suddenly, your bedroom door slams open. The darkened room fills with police officers. They pull you and your wife out of bed and detain you. You're shocked. You're scared. You ask what crime you've committed, and you're told that you've broken the law. You see, your crime is that you have a different skin color than your wife. In June 1958, in Virginia, this happened to Richard Loving and his wife, Mildred Jeter. Richard was a white construction worker. Mildred was a woman of black and Native American ancestry. Their marriage was illegal under Virginia's miscegenation laws. These statutes existed solely to prevent marriage based on the racial identities of the couples. They were hauled into court and given an ultimatum: leave Virginia or be put in jail for a year. They chose exile. They left their home, their job, their friends and neighbors, and relocated to Washington, D.C. This story isn't just about a chapter in civil rights history. It's about how some laws are created not out of ethical consideration, but out of morality itself. Morality here doesn't ask who is harmed. It doesn't explain who is being protected. It appeals to authority. It asserts itself as right. Without offering a justification, a law becomes a law unto itself. This episode isn't about old laws or ancient history. It's about a recurring pattern in ethical life. What happens when we let rules stand in for ethics? What happens when obedience to those rules takes precedence over ethical judgment? We've already talked about the difference between ethics and morality, how morality can be understood as a system of rules derived from authority, and how ethics is derived from personal responsibility. The legal persecution of Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter demonstrates what goes wrong when society's laws refuse to engage with why something is harmful at all. Miscegenation laws don't just deny marriage. They declare that the very fact of a marriage between two people is harmful, with no explanation provided on how it's harmful or what the law is trying to protect. That's moral authority without any ethical justification. And that's what we mean when we talk about rules replacing reason. So let's talk about rules and reason. Rules are important in any society. They let us coordinate behaviors, reduce friction, communicate expectations, and promote trust between one another. They provide a framework for all of us to live with, and it means that we can evaluate a situation from settled solutions without having to recreate rules from scratch each time. But rules also have limits. A rule defines what is permitted or forbidden, absent nuance. It presumes context where ethical reason might once have existed, and it can become a substitute for thinking about harm. In the case of anti-miscegenation statutes, the law presumed harm on the basis of race alone. It was not based on ethical reasoning. It did not explain how mixed-race marriages caused harm. No evidence was provided on the unsuitability of such marriages. No statistics, no scientific justification. It was simply declared. Ethics, as we've defined it, doesn't start with a rule. It starts with a series of questions. Who is affected? Does harm occur? And what does responsibility demand in this situation? Ethics can't arrive at a conclusion until these questions are answered. A rule about marriage might ban certain types of unions, but ethics asks, Why? Who is hurt? And what is the justification for treating this union differently? Without those questions, a rule just boils down to moral preferences. Rules can be ethical, but only if it can be justified by inquiring deeply into the questions of harm, context, and justification. A law that states your marriage is illegal due to your race isn't a valid ethical claim because it doesn't state what harm it's caused. It relies on authority, not reasoning. It treats obedience as an ethical endpoint. This is a rule without reason. This is morality instituting a prohibition without justification. And it leads to consequences that are unmistakably unethical. Richard and Mildred lived those consequences. They were forced from their home. They were separated from loved ones. They were stripped of autonomy. This all because the rule mattered more than the reason behind it. The same ethical pattern shows up elsewhere, not just in marriage, but in private life itself. For decades in the United States, laws existed that criminalized private, consensual intimacy between adults of the same sex. These were commonly known as sodomy laws. In 1998, in Texas, police entered an apartment after receiving a false report of a disturbance. Inside, they found two men engaged in intimate contact. There was no violence involved. There was no victim. Still, both men were arrested. Not because anyone had been harmed, but because the law declared that their activity, their relationship, was illegal. Like the Lovings, their private lives were intruded upon by the police. Like the Lovings, they were arrested. Like the Lovings, they were put on trial because of the nature of their relationship. And like the Lovings, the law gave no ethical justification for existing. Who is this law protecting, and why? The law simply asserted itself, and that's the point. Look, you don't need to agree with every law. You just need to understand the justification behind it, the reasoning that supports it, the mechanisms of enforcement that it instates. When laws are justified by tradition, authority, moral assertion without explanation, or just by the fact that some are made to feel uncomfortable by a certain type of activity, they just become tools of arbitrary power. When laws are untethered from ethical examination, they can codify prejudice, legitimize harm, silence reasoned debate, and make obedience feel like a virtue. In 1967, in a Supreme Court case, Loving v. Virginia, miscegenation laws were struck down, holding that bans on interracial marriage violated both due process and equal protection under the Constitution. In 2003, the Supreme Court declared that sodomy laws were unconstitutional based on the Fourth Amendment, overturning many previous precedents. In 2015, the Supreme Court upheld the right for gay people to be married. Such ethical victories took time to come to fruition. Unethical laws take time and social pressure to be overturned. The ethical reasoning needs to make its way into society, like water pushing through small cracks in the soil, to emerge to the surface, to be seen. So when we look at what happened to the Lovings, we aren't just looking at a historical injustice. We're looking at a society that accepted the idea that obedience to a rule was itself an ethical outcome. And that forces a harder set of questions. How many of the laws we live with today aren't grounded in ethical reasoning at all, but in moral authority? How often do we follow rules without ever asking why those rules exist? And when does obedience begin to override our duty to judgment? These questions don't disappear just because some unjust laws are no longer on the books. Laws grounded in moral authority, laws that don't even attempt to explain or justify themselves, still exist. Now. And they will exist in the future. It's only through ethical reasoning that we can protect ourselves from those who would criminalize acts simply because they can.